A man digs up a long sealed box from his backyard. Inside, he finds $400,000 in cash and a blood-stained baseball bat. 19 years ago, this very bat was the reason he was sent to prison. The man's name is Frankie, once a low-ranking member in a local crime boss's organization. This crime boss, known as Bloody Hands Chris, was notoriously brutal. Those who offended him would always receive special treatment. When a ball was hit out of the warehouse, Frankie and his brothers were instructed to search for it. Upon returning, Frankie witnessed a horrific scene. His enraged boss had beaten a man to death with the baseball bat. After it was over, the boss made a promise. Frankie would take the fall and go to prison in his place. The promised 5-year sentence ultimately became 19 years, and Frankie transformed from a spirited young man into a weathered old one. As if that wasn't enough, he developed severe insomnia. Doctors warned him that without proper rest, he would face dementia and death. With no effective treatment available, Frankie was granted early parole. Back in his cell, Frankie packed away photos of his wife and son, his only emotional support during those 19 years. Upon leaving prison, he saw his son Joseph waiting for him. After all these years, Joseph had grown from a mischievous child into a young man. Seeing his son's weathered face, Frankie felt tremendous guilt. Shortly after his imprisonment, his wife had passed away from excessive grief, leaving young Joseph an orphan who lived a life of transience. Joseph resented his father, causing tension in their relationship. All of this was caused by boss Chris, and Frankie planned to make him pay for his deception. Frankie returned to his old house and dug up the box that had been buried for 19 years. Inside were $400,000 and the baseball bat Chris had used to kill the man. Afterward, he took his son to a 5-star hotel, determined to make up for everything Joseph had missed. They booked a presidential suite, and after Frankie enjoyed a hot bath, he took Joseph on a shopping spree: designer watches, custom suits, expensive sports cars, sparing no expense for his son. Through these gestures, Joseph gradually began to accept his father, and their relationship improved. The father and son, no longer distant, acted more like brothers. Joseph encouraged his father to approach a beautiful woman nearby. Though somewhat uncomfortable, Frankie eventually met Jennifer, and they quickly began dating. At the height of their connection, they celebrated properly. Once everything had settled, Frankie initiated his revenge plan. He first sought out his old friend, Sleepy, intending to purchase weapons. However, the young thug at the door didn't recognize him and even pulled out a weapon.
Come on, kid. Take it easy. I'm just here to do some business with Sleepy.
Sleepy's been dead for 6 years.
Doesn't change what I'm bringing to the table.
The girl speaking was Sleepy's daughter, who had taken over her father's business after his death. Frankie felt sad remembering all his old friends who had passed away. Learning that Frankie needed guns, she took him to the warehouse and gave him an Uzi submachine gun with a compensator, along with a 1911 pistol. With these weapons, Frankie first sought out his former best friend from the gang, Kay, who now ran a bar. The old comrades embraced tightly after years apart. Frankie then explained his intent. He wanted to know Chris' whereabouts. But Kay claimed Chris had died many years ago, saying that shortly after Frankie went to prison, Chris suffered a stroke and passed away soon after. Frankie believed Kay without question, then asked about 2 of the boss's former henchmen, Jimmy and Dragon, who had advised the boss and caused Frankie to take the fall. But Kay said he had left the life years ago and knew nothing about them.
You sure?
Yeah.
How about now?
Oh, wait. Frankie, I swear, okay, I don't know where they are.
Don't lie to me.
I'm not lying to you, okay? Look, come on, man.
Frankie ultimately chose to believe him. Shortly after returning to his lodging, Frankie's insomnia struck again. He became drowsy and disoriented. Remembering the doctor's warning that without proper rest, only death awaited him, Frankie knew his time was limited and continued his mission without delay. He visited Dragon's favorite club and indeed found him there. Dragon appeared unsurprised by Frankie's appearance, remaining calm throughout. Frankie intended to question him about the details of that incident years ago, but unexpectedly, Dragon accidentally mentioned Chris's name.
Max is alive.
Oh, shit.
Realizing his mistake, Dragon knocked away Frankie's gun and fled the room. Frankie quickly gave chase but was ambushed by Dragon at the door. They struggled intensely, but due to his physical condition, Frankie quickly lost ground and his weapon was knocked away. Dragon threw a punch and Frankie responded with a flurry of blows. Dragon tightly choked Frankie, who eventually managed to break free. But by the time he retrieved his gun, Dragon had already escaped. Frankie then found Jimmy, who had become a butcher after leaving the gang. Like Dragon, Jimmy remained calm when confronted but approached the situation with resignation. Frankie was curious why Jimmy didn't run.
I figured I'd help run longer than I deserve. One thing first, if you don't mind.
Jimmy revealed that after Chris suffered his stroke, his son placed him in a nursing home, though he didn't know the exact location. Despite receiving this information, Frankie showed no gratitude and pulled the trigger anyway. Back at the hotel, Frankie asked a server to list all the nursing homes in the area. He then drove from place to place, searching for Chris. During this process, he suddenly received a distress call from his son. Joseph hung up before finishing, leaving Frankie panicked. He immediately turned his car around and raced to the location Joseph had sent. Upon arrival, Frankie found his son lying on the bed, barely breathing from an overdose. He immediately began administering aid, and fortunately, his timely actions saved his son's life. Faced with his son's condition, Frankie felt remorseful. If he had stayed by his son's side, none of this would have happened. But it was too late for such thoughts. Early the next morning, accompanied by Joseph, Frankie visited the cemetery to pay respects to his late wife. But when he arrived at the gravestone, he saw his son's tombstone nearby. It turned out that 19 years ago, when Frankie took the fall for Chris and went to prison, Chris had promised to look after his family. However, just 2 years ago, Chris suddenly ordered his men to kill Joseph. Upon learning this, Frankie began suffering from chronic insomnia, eventually developing dissociative insomnia. Missing his son terribly, Frankie had been hallucinating that his son was still with him. Everything he had done to make up for lost time with his son was merely a product of his wishful thinking. Finally, Frankie found the stroke-afflicted Chris in a nursing home. The duty nurse informed him that Chris had been bedridden for 15 years. Clearly, the information about his son being killed by Chris's orders 2 years ago wasn't accurate. Additionally, Frankie learned a shocking fact. Throughout these 15 years, someone named Kay had been regularly visiting Chris. Frankie suddenly understood. Kay's claim that Chris was dead had been a lie. As he prepared to confront Kay, he was ambushed by Dragon, who opened fire on him. Frankie quickly dived for cover, and a gunfight ensued. Outgunned, he needed a good strategy. Noticing Dragon's exposed legs, he fired without hesitation. Shot in the leg, Dragon collapsed to the ground in agony. Frankie calmly approached him.
Frankie, I guess it's my day, huh?
They won't be calling you the Dragon anymore.
After finishing, he quickly drove away from the scene. Meanwhile, Kay was attending his daughter's wedding. As he entered the restroom, he found Frankie holding his daughter at gunpoint. Kay tried to intervene, but Frankie unhesitatingly shot him in the thigh. At this point, Kay had no choice but to confess everything. He had indeed killed Frankie's son. After Chris's stroke, Kay had taken over his operations. Shortly after Frankie's imprisonment, his son had become addicted to drugs and constantly demanded money and drugs from Kay. He became increasingly reckless and even threatened to tell the police about Kay's activities if his demands weren't met. Joseph's threats became unbearable, so Kay ordered his elimination. After hearing this, Frankie stood up and aimed his gun at Kay, who quickly shielded his daughter. But in the end, Frankie couldn't pull the trigger. Having lost his son, he didn't want this innocent girl to lose her father. He dropped his weapon and walked toward the door. Even when the girl shot him from behind, Frankie showed no anger. He dragged his tired body out of the church. Outside, police had surrounded the building. Frankie put his hands behind his back, and the officers, thinking he had a gun, all opened fire. Thus, Frankie fell into a pool of blood, still holding the photo of his son that he had just taken from his waistband.